It is a pleasure to be here today, and it is a great setup as we talk about what is that intersection between science and perception, and how do we link those two in a way that fundamentally builds consumer trust and confidence. That's what we're focused on at the Center for Food Integrity, to build that consumer trust and confidence in today's food system. We do that by sharing accurate, balanced information, correcting misinformation, highlighting those practices that build trust, those companies, associations, and organizations that are doing a good job of building trust, and then engaging stakeholders from across the food system on a lot of different projects to see how we can better build consensus around the kinds of issues that have been raised, that intensive agriculture is, in fact, sustainable agriculture and better for the environment. So I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the fundamentals and the foundation for building consumer trust, and then I want to shift gears and tell the story of today's agriculture in a way that I hope you can borrow. Tell the story in a way that we can fundamentally redefine who we are as the ethical choice for people, animals, and the planet. Now, those involved in agriculture did not choose to get involved because of a passion for public relations or public policy. They got involved because they have a passion for agriculture. They love what they do, whether it's with crops or animals, whatever it happens to be, and all they're looking for is the ability to have a maximum freedom to operate. Let me do what I do on my farm with a minimum amount of outside interference. And in today's environment, that requires us to earn and maintain a social license, which is significantly different than how we used to operate. But today, we really have to earn that privilege of operating with minimal formalized restrictions based on maintaining public trust by doing what's right. And we see those restrictions come in a number of different forms, whether it's increased regulation or legislation, or in today, perhaps more efficiently and more effectively, through the marketplace. And BST would be a terrific illustration of that, where you had a product that was FDA approved, had been used in the marketplace for a number of years. A handful of brands decided they no longer wanted that associated with their brand or their products, and that technology disappeared just that quickly. There were no public hearings, there was no promulgation process, there was no way to really effectively intervene in that discussion. And public trust is the belief that our activities are consistent with social expectations, the values of the community, and other stakeholders. And as Frank mentioned, the popular perception is that intensive production is less sustainable production. That really what we want to do is have more fields of production, that we want to have more animals out on pasture, that really is the right thing to do. That's the popular perception in terms of what we need to do to build that public trust. And I want to make the very strong argument today that maintaining that social license is not an act of altruism. This is not about public relations. It's about enlightened self-interest. Because when you lose that social license, your cost of operating goes up. 25 years ago, we had broad social license for how we managed animal waste in the United States. Because of the change in size and scale and the types of operations we have and a few high-profile manure spills, we lost that social license. And now we have very strict requirements in terms of how we manage animal waste. We're seeing that social license be questioned today in terms of our use of animal health products and other technologies that we use to enhance productivity. And once we cross from social license over to that tipping point on social control, all of a sudden it's much more rigid, bureaucratic, and significantly higher cost. There was an article in USA Today last week where they featured some wildcat drillers who were talking about the fact that they weren't sure they were going to be able to survive in this new environment post BP's spill in the Gulf, because the regulatory environment has changed so much that the requirements are simply very difficult to be met by smaller operators. So when that social license is lost, we also see its speed consolidation and integration, because the cost of compliance requires a certain scale to be even able to play in that ballgame. Let me give you a non-ag illustration. The accounting profession, if you look at self-regulation there on the bottom of the left-hand side, the accounting profession had done a terrific job of establishing their own self-regulatory mechanisms. The Financial Accounting Standard Board, certified public accountants, generally accepted accounting principles. Then we had Arthur Andersen and Enron and WorldCom take place, and Congress stepped in and said, you know what, boys, you've just violated the public trust. We're taking away your social license, and we're going to replace it with social control in the form of Sarbanes-Oxley. And the average cost of complying with Sarbanes-Oxley for a public company is between $10 and $15 million a year. Those are dollars that could have been invested in research and development. They could have been returned to creating new jobs, returned to investors, but instead they're spent on regulatory compliance. So it is enlightened self-interest. It is in your economic best interest to maintain that social license, and it's worth investing in it to make sure that happens. And as I said, that social license is based on maintaining trust. A few years ago, we did a stakeholder engagement process, and one of the corporate responsibility vice presidents for one of the leading quick service chains said, you know, agriculture has it wrong. You think you have an image issue. You don't have an image issue. You have a trust issue. And that's a fundamentally different way of looking at the problem. If you think it's about image, you approach it one way. If you think it's about trust, you approach it a different way. So we partnered with Steve Sapp at Iowa State University to see if we could begin to discover what drives trust. We did a meta-analysis of 21 different pieces of research and identified 3 primary drivers. The first on the bottom that you see there is influential others. That includes your family and friends as well as credentialed individuals whose opinions you respect. People in this audience, veterinarians, scientists, doctors, dietitians, etc. The second element in building trust is competence, which is our skills, technical capacity, and science, and our ability to demonstrate that we're doing a good job. The third element in building trust is confidence, or the perception of shared values. Can I count on you to do the right thing? Notice the distinction between doing a good job and doing the right thing. So we surveyed 6,000 consumers over 3 years on food safety, nutrition, animal welfare, and sustainability. And what we discovered in doing the structural equation modeling around that is that the perception of shared values or ethics is 3 to 5 times more important than demonstrating our competency in building trust. Now that requires us to completely rethink how we engage with the public. Because historically what we have done in agriculture and in animal agriculture is given people more data. If we have the science, if we have the research, surely people will be rational, they'll look at the data, and they will come to our side of the argument. What we discovered is that's not the case. That's not the way the trust-building process works. We have to first communicate our commitment to shared values, to do what's right, and then support it with science. Because if we get the equation switched, we're not likely to be successful in engaging consumers in meaningful dialogue. So what does it mean? It's the old Roosevelt quote, they really don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And in some focus groups we did in 2009 around the country, what we heard from consumers was, we're not sure that you still care. What they told us was, we trust farmers, but we're not sure that what you're still doing today is farming. We think farmers are people of integrity. We think farmers are people who work hard, who are committed to doing what's right. But when we see the change in size and scale and your use of technology, we're not so sure we should still assign those attributes to you in agriculture, because we're not sure that you still share those values because we're less comfortable and less familiar with who you are and what you do. And that was a key finding, because again, it helps us reshape and rethink who we are and how we engage with the public. So when we think about building a sustainable balance for support and for long-term consumer trust at the Center for Food Integrity, we use the triangle as a metaphor for that because of its great structural integrity. And the foundation of that triangle is about communicating to consumers our commitment to the values that are important to them. Things like compassion, responsibility, respect, fairness, and truth. The second side of that is about scientific verification, making sure that we can demonstrate with that objective, measurable, repeatable data the claims that we're making. And the third side is about economic viability, because at the end of the day, if you're not economically viable, you're not truly sustainable. But here's where we've gotten the conversation confused. When consumers are asking questions today, they're generally asking questions at the bottom of that triangle. Should you use production enhancement technology? Should you house the animals the way you're housing them? Should you use hormones to increase production? Should you use antibiotics to increase production? Should you be that intensive in your production practices? And generally what we've told them is, science says we can. Can and should aren't the same question. We've substituted scientific verification for ethical justification. And we need to better understand that and communicate our commitment to ethical justification and then support it with scientific verification. So to go back to Frank's example, when someone says, you know, I really feel like it would be much better if we just had those cows out on pasture. Wouldn't that really be better for the environment? Well, rather than immediately jumping into the data, help them understand that, you know, I really appreciate your question. I can tell from that question you care a great deal about the environment. And I respect that and appreciate that because I do as well. And in fact, what we've discovered is that by bringing the animals into more intensive production systems, we're able to produce more food using fewer natural resources and freezing our environmental footprint. So at the end of the day, these more intensive production systems actually help us preserve the environment, which is important to you and important to me. So rather than just giving them the data, we help them understand, we share their values, and here's the information to support the claims that we make. Because when we give them information about science or economics, we increase their knowledge, but we don't necessarily do anything to change how they feel or what they believe. And people are much more likely to act on how they feel and what they believe than on what they know. So we're not going to educate our way to consumer trust. We're going to have to engage consumers and participate in a fundamentally different conversation. But the public does sense there's change in the way food is produced, but they really don't understand. And that lack of understanding creates the opening in that information vacuum, which is too frequently filled by our detractors, those who really don't support who we are and what they do, and they are not making scientifically based arguments. They're making value-based arguments, that what we're doing today is ethically wrong, that it's unethical, unhealthy, and unsustainable. And we can't combat that just with science. We have to engage in that values-based communication that strikes a balance between being ethically grounded, scientifically verified, and economically viable to build public trust. And we have to understand how that conversation needs to evolve if we're going to be successful long term. Because times have fundamentally changed, right? We don't produce food the way we used to produce food. Consumers' attitudes have changed. They are generationally and geographically removed from who we are and what we do in agriculture. So we have to change significantly how we're going to operate if we want to protect that social license that protects the freedom to operate for those who are farmers. So I'd like to begin this discussion about how we reframe who we are and what we do by asking the question, what is the ethical choice? So we can begin to reframe today's agriculture in a way that helps us reclaim that ethical high ground. You know, you've got two very distinct opinions that are represented on the screen. And what a fundamental dichotomy it is. The Chinese premier saying it's his dream to provide every Chinese, especially children, sufficient milk every day. And what a wonderful dream. And at the same time, you've got the First Lady of the United States who's launched a campaign to combat childhood obesity. Now, both of those are very legitimate social concerns. So what role should those of us in agriculture play in helping to address both of them and in answering those? And what is the ethical choice? Because we really aren't having much of a national conversation today. We've tended to kind of get back into our bunkers. We've got these two-armed camps that are deeply suspicious of one another, lobbing these mine bombs back and forth at each other, leaving the public in the middle kind of confused about what they should believe and who they should support when it comes to today's food system. And we're so fortunate to have an abundance of choice. I can have lunch at McDonald's or Chipotle, buy my groceries at Whole Foods or Walmart or the local farmer market, but we've tended to create this discussion as though there's controversial foods and controversy-free foods, right? You've got the good food aisle in the supermarket and the bad food aisle. And it depends on your values and your beliefs and which supermarket you choose to shop in. We know the discussion is much more complex than that. And what many are suggesting is, you know what we ought to do? We simply need to go back. We need to slow the food system down and go back to the good old days, the 1950s, the way things used to be, because that's how they should be. And in one of our focus groups in Des Moines, there was a woman who said, you know, on my way to work every morning, I drive by the road, and on one side of the road, there's barn after barn after barn of these big hog houses, but I never see any animals. They've got this big lagoon, and I see these trucks go in and out, but I don't ever see any pigs. I'd much rather get my pork from the guy across the road who raises them in the pasture the way they're supposed to be. And that's the kind of feedback we get. That's the kind of anecdotal information that we get from consumers. So what is the ethical choice? You know, in 1950, we had about 154 million people in the United States, 5.5 million farmers, and one farmer produced enough food to feed about 30. Fortunately, today, we have double the population, fewer than half the number of farmers, but one farmer feeds 155. So if we did turn the clock back, what would happen? If the number of farms and level of productivity have remained constant since 1950, there'd be no food for anyone in California, Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, or Georgia. Now, depending on where your in-laws live, that might be okay with you. But there are 151 million Americans who would go without food. So it's pretty difficult to argue that that would be the ethical choice for people, animals, and the planet. And I think the heightened public interest in who we are and what we do has provided us an opportunity we have not had in generations to really re-engage in this discussion. And the increase that we're likely to see in food prices over the next several years gives us the opportunity to, again, redefine today's food system. Because the media is going to be looking for a villain, a victim, and a vindicator. We do not want agriculture to be painted as the villain as food prices continue to increase. And regardless of the type of production you're engaged in, the public has a right to expect us to behave in a responsible manner. And those who don't should be held accountable. And we need to do a better job of holding each other accountable when we violate the public trust. Because if agriculture's voice is not the first voice in that discussion, the assumption is that we all operate at the lowest common denominator. So this new public interest provides us the opportunity to do a couple of things. First of all, look in the mirror. Are there things in which we are engaged that we cannot support ethically? Are there things that we don't believe are consistent with consumer values for things like compassion, responsibility, respect, fairness, and truth? Or do we simply need to reframe them in a way to help consumers understand they are, in fact, consistent with their values? And secondly, we've got to do a much better job of telling our story. We can no longer be successful confusing scientific verification for ethical justification. We need to understand the two and develop those ethically sound messages to describe who we are and what we do. So I'd like to use a BLT and a glass of milk to tell the story of today's agriculture. And I hope this is a story you can take with you and share as well. It starts with bacon. And I'm not talking about that stuff you can see through. I'm talking about those good, thick slices that you cook until they're nice and crisp. Now, compared to 1950, we produce 176 more pork per sow with 44% fewer sows. Now, if we only talk about the increases in productivity and efficiency, what we hear back from consumers is, so what? I don't care. Those benefits accrue to agribusiness. They don't accrue to me. So what we can do in telling that story is to say, you know what that means? For every package of bacon that you take off the shelf, it took less land. It took less water. It took less grain and produced a smaller environmental footprint than any package of bacon you've ever picked off the shelf before. And the exact same thing will be true next year because of the continuous improvements we've made. In addition, because we've moved the animals indoors, we know from research from the University of Missouri and other places that those animals are actually healthier than they've ever been. So the productivity benefits can't accrue to us. No one cares if it's good for you. The productivity benefits have to accrue to society and have to accrue to consumers. And that's the story we have to tell. And then share the values of the terrific men and women who are involved in food production. Folks like Kenny Brinker who say because we take care of the animals the way we do, we pride ourselves in supplying a safe, nutritious, and affordable product. Corn, a primary ingredient in feed for pork production as well as poultry and cattle, just phenomenal statistics in terms of productivity. Compared to 1950, 333% more corn on 11% more acres. That means for every bushel that came to market, fewer crop chemicals, less water, less land was involved. And Kurt Stiefvater knows that his proper care and husbandry of the soil and crop allows him to look forward to passing it on to the next generation, whether his daughters or other relatives, to keep producing the food they do for the world. Lettuce and tomatoes, it's almost that time of year in Kansas City and Missouri where you can begin to plant your own and get some satisfaction from putting seed into soil. But if you don't have that opportunity, we can count on others to do it for us. Monterey, California, compared to 1950, 12 times the production of lettuce on 2.5 times the land. Better seed, better cropping technology, better use of irrigation, allowing us to produce more using fewer resources. The same is true with tomatoes from Yolo County, California. And Jason Rulich from Michigan loves being able to supply his state with safe and healthy fresh vegetables from his greenhouse operation in Michigan. Now, my experience has been that when you grew up, you were either in a mayonnaise or a Miracle Whip household, right? Okay. I grew up in a Miracle Whip household. By a show of hands, who else? Miracle Whip? Okay. Mayonnaise? Okay. I grew up in a Miracle Whip. My wife grew up in a mayonnaise household. So in our refrigerator at home, we have mayonnaise. I'm married. Come on. Jiminy Christmas. 2 primary ingredients, eggs and soybean oil. Eggs, what a remarkable story of productivity. Compared to 1950, 53% more eggs on 3% fewer hens. And I love the last sentence from Harry Herbrook. We want our customers to feel good when they consume our product, knowing how much care is given to each dozen eggs. Not a word about housing, not a word about productivity, not a word about feed conversion, but how much he cares about every dozen eggs that go to the consumer. Soybean oil used in food production, things like mayonnaise, meal used in livestock feed. Another remarkable story for a product that is relatively recent to the market. Since 1950, we produce 11 times more beans on 5 times the acre. Vicki Coughlin, a good friend from Wisconsin, knows the challenges of producing food for a growing population, knows that their farm is going to be part of making that happen going forward. Bread, love to bake bread. A favorite uncle gave me a recipe before he passed. Wheat, one of the primary ingredients. We produce 69% more wheat on 6% fewer acres. Folks like Chet Ettinger make that happen every day. He gets a good feeling to provide food, fuel, and fiber for others all around the world. And milk, one of the things that Frank was talking about, there are a few stories more impressive than the increases in productivity we've seen in dairy. Compared to 1950, we produce 63% more milk with 58% fewer cows. That means for every gallon of milk, every pound of butter, every package of cheese you take off the shelf, it took less land, less water, produced less manure than ever before. And the exact same thing will be true next year. And great folks like Stephanie Dykeshorn in Iowa says everything they do is for the health and safety of the cows and the quality product that ends up on the grocery store shelf. So with that remarkable increase in productivity, surely we can meet the world's growing demand for food, right? Well, you've already heard that's not the case. But here's the story you can begin to share with others. We have record high food insecurity in the United States. 14.6% of U.S. households food insecure in 2008, up from 11% in 2007, the highest recorded rate since 1995. And this last bullet is shocking and somewhat disappointing. Approximately 60% of the 30 million children who participate in the school lunch program receive free or reduced price meals, 73% in New York, 84% in Chicago, 67% in Miami, and this at a time when we spend less on food than any other country in the world. And look at the change between 1908 and today. We've decreased the percentage of our income we spend on food by 400% in the United States. That means there are more dollars for consumers to invest to keep our economy growing and improve the quality of life for their families in so many different ways because they have a remarkably affordable food supply. And yet we still have 1 billion people around the world and 11 million in the U.S. that go to bed hungry. And as we've heard from our previous speakers, by mid-century we'll have about 3 billion more people. Now, I did go to Nebraska, so math was never my strong suit, so I'm going to break that down into some smaller pieces to make it a little more understandable. That's another 75.5 million annually, or adding another Iran to the world every single year. Breaking it down into more bite-sized pieces, another Los Angeles and Chicago added to the planet every single month. Or if you want to make it even smaller, we're adding a new Philadelphia to the planet every single week. Those are numbers consumers can relate to. You can begin to make this a story that they understand if you help them understand the impact and make it very understandable and relatable to illustrations that are relevant to them. And in 40 years, we're going to have to double food production, have 100% more calories than we produce today. Now, I probably could have done this entire presentation with this slide. And many of you are probably wondering, then why didn't you? But Norman Borlaug in 2000 said, you know, we have the technology to feed 10 billion people on a sustainable basis. The pertinent question today is whether farmers and ranchers will be permitted to use this technology. And the question I would ask you and every organization that you represent is, what are you doing to earn and maintain the social license so that farmers will have access to that technology, that they will continue to be able to use that technology, not just in the United States, but in the developing world as well. Jason Clay in the World Wildlife Fund says by almost any measure, producing food has the largest impact of any human activity. We're going to have to double those calories on the exact same amount of land if we want to preserve biodiversity and ecosystem functions. And over the last years, we've tested messages with consumers. By giving them the right information, we were able to get them to support Frank's position that more intensive production is sustainable production, is better for the environment. So we can get there, but we're going to have to be careful about how we make that happen. Our current growth and productivity is not going to get us where we need to be. We're currently increasing agricultural productivity by about 1.4% per year. We've got to get to 1.75% per year to be able to close that gap and double the number of calories we produce by 2050. And if we can't close that gap, it means a significant number of people aren't going to have food. That number is roughly 300 million, or the population of the United States by 2050. Pretty difficult to argue that that would be the ethical choice for people, animals, and the planet. 80% of that future growth is going to have to come from increased yields through the responsible use of innovation and technology, something we know consumers are concerned about. Only 10 to 15% could come from higher cropping density, and only 5 to 10% from the expansion of land use. We know the product of land is already in production. So what are the three things you can do? What are the three things you can do to begin to tell that story, to change that dialogue, and build consumer trust and confidence in today's food system? First of all, engage consumers and support choice. Notice I didn't say educate consumers. If you were to go around and ask consumers, how many of you would like to be educated about today's food system? Exactly. How many of you think would answer yes? Not very many. But they do want to be engaged. They want to participate in a conversation. They want to know that somebody in agriculture shares their values and is willing to have a conversation with them. And support choice. If we don't support choice, it feels as though all we're doing is supporting status quo. If people want to buy local, organic, natural, from a farmer's market, conventional, traditional, whatever, all of those choices should be accepted and supported because they all give them access to safe, nutritious, affordable food. And they have those options because of the remarkable affordability we have, and regardless of the system it comes from, consumers have the absolute right to expect us to behave in a responsible manner, and we should be held accountable if we don't. Second, encourage people to learn more about food and understand the consequences of policy and market decisions. Decisions have consequences. And when our social license is at risk, if we see decisions that limit our ability to increase productivity, we're going to see increased hunger in the U.S., around the world, and for future generations. Not something any of us want to see happen, and not something we can support. And finally, support those responsible food production systems that allow us to produce the food we need using fewer resources to meet the growing global demand for food. We know from testing that's a position that consumers will support, that they will support the request to help us support responsible systems that allow us to grow the food we need using fewer natural resources to meet growing global demand. That's what we do in agriculture. We continue to improve our systems to produce more with less every year, but we have to reframe the discussion and help people understand that that is, in fact, the ethical choice for people, animals, and the planet.